Hi,
Lee.
everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today for this afternoon talk with Martin Walker. We are thrilled to have you here today. Hi.
Hello.
Greetings
From France.
Martin Walker is a senior fellow of the Global Business Policy Council, a private think tank based in Washington, D.C. He is editor-in-chief emeritus of and international affairs columnist at United Press International. Most of you watching this today, though, know him as the author of our best-selling French mystery series featuring Bruno, Chief of Police. He's here today, as he said, joining us from the Perigord to talk about his latest book, The Shooting at Chateau Rock, and we're so lucky for the opportunity to chat with him. If you have any questions for him, John, our event coordinator here at the store, is behind the scenes, and he'll be feeding me questions from you guys in the Facebook comments for the second half of this chat. So let's get going. How are you?
I'm okay, I guess. I'm alive. I don't have the virus. I've been quite lucky on one level in that I've been locked down here in France in my place in the Perigord. So I've had the benefit of a garden and my dog and my chickens and my neighbors, but we have to wear masks and so on. My biggest problem is that I've been locked down in France since early March, but my wife, Julia, has been locked down in London. And that's been a bit of a bore, I have to say. It's been a problem. So, but at least we've been working together remotely because some of you know, I think, that we produced a couple of cookbooks because Bruno cooks an awful lot. And they came out in Europe first, and now my publisher in the States is going to be bringing a Bruno cookbook next year in English. So Julia and I have been perfecting the version that's going to be coming out for the States. And I can't wait to come and present that to you guys at Murder by the Book in Houston. And how are things with you?
We're well. Speaking of the cookbook, we were very happy that you agreed to make a limited edition recipe card available for us. So we just picked these up from the printers today. And on the back, there's a recipe for little blue cheese tarts. If you order Shooting at Chateau Rock, or if you've already ordered a copy from us and picked it up, we have a postcard here with your name on it. So that's kind of a fun thing we thought we could do since we couldn't have you here in person. And thank you for agreeing to send a recipe.
Well, I wish I were there. In fact, it's been, normally the whole month of May, I'm on a European book tour in Germany, Austria, Switzerland, Poland, and so on. And then I fly direct to the States. And I should be right now with you guys over in Houston, but maybe we'll just have to do it all again next year.
Well, I will say the one thing that's been interesting about doing this and trying to adapt to virtual events so quickly is that when we knew we couldn't have authors in store, there's no limit to where we can talk to you from at this point. So fortunately, you're in France and we're still able to communicate. So great. And as far as your wife in England, at least you have the dog there to keep you company, although the dog won't talk back.
You don't know basset hounds. They talk back all the time.
That is true. That is true. Okay, so let's dive in. We have quite a few viewers of our online videos who are finding new authors. So to start off, why don't you tell us about Bruno, the star of your series?
Okay. When we first got our place in France, it was a holiday home over 20 years ago now. One of my neighbors in my little village, a man called, we all know him as the Baron. He and I became friends. He took me down to join the local rugby club because he knew I'd played rugby, as you can see from my nose, which got broken quite comprehensively. And he also knew that I played tennis. So he took me down to the rugby club, the tennis club, and I joined. And every Friday morning, I would play sort of old guys tennis very gently with half a dozen other French guys. And then, this being France, we would go back to the tennis club where the biggest and best room was the kitchen. And we would make ourselves lunch. Now, in France, that's a serious business. We would go on till about 4 or 5 o'clock in the afternoon on lunch. And one of the guys who was there he'd been 10 years in the French army. He was an excellent cook, taught me how to make an omelette with truffles. He was a keen hunter. He spent his spare time teaching the local kids to play rugby in the winter, tennis in the summer, and he was our local village policeman. And he hated to carry a gun, hated to arrest anybody. He knew everybody in the region. You know, he'd danced at all the weddings. He'd helped carry the great grandfathers to their funerals. I mean, he just knew everybody, and everybody trusted him and liked him. And I thought, well, this is a wonderful character. And this is what policing ought to be in a way. It's only possible in the countryside, but and I thought, I've got to start writing about this guy. I'd already written my first novel about the Périgord, which was called The Caves of Périgord, which was about what kind of society could have made this great prehistoric cave art of Lascaux, the 18,000 years old, but you know, when Picasso first saw it in the 1940s, he came out and said, "We have met our masters. You know, we have learned nothing in 18,000 years." So I loved Lascaux. I visited every year still, and I wrote a novel about that. And then I began writing the Bruno stories. And this was where Julia, my wife, was so important, because our local chief of police is called Pierrot. And I wrote this novel. I called him Pierrot just in the draft. Right. And Julia said, no, you've got to have an international name for this guy. How about Bruno? Then she said, I think you might have something here, because Julia had worked in publishing in London. She said, now, publishers are always more interested if there's a series. So go away and write 5 paragraphs, one on each of the next 5 Bruno books you're going to write. Now, Julia is always right, so yes, ma'am. I did the 5 extra paragraphs on the future books, and off it went. And pretty soon we'd sold it in the States, Holland, Germany, Britain, and boom. Now we're in 19 languages around the world. So that was how I began writing the Bruno books. And the thing about being here in this part of France, this magical part of France called the Périgord, is that you never run out of ideas. I mean, there is just so much history here. It's I always like to sort of tell people that Paris is not entirely France. Paris is its own country, as it were, but the Périgord is also not entirely France. It's much older than France. France begins really, I guess, in the 6th century with the king of the Franks, who was called Clovis. Well, history here goes back yonks longer than that. So I've mentioned Lascaux 18,000 years ago. If I walk out of my place and I walk across an old stone bridge through the village and just up another half a mile, I come to a place called La Ferracie. It's a rock shelter, just a kind of a dip like that in the rocks. But that was the first place that we know ever in history that human beings buried one another with ritual and respect. And we know that the woman who was buried, the archaeologists found the pollen. She was buried with a necklace of flowers around her neck. There were children who were there. They were buried with stones around their heads, as it were, to protect them. 72,000 years ago. Wow. So this idea of so much history, and you know, Julius Caesar, just another walk from where I live is an old hilltop where in the Iron Age, the old Gauls had a hilltop fort. Julius Caesar himself, his legions, when he was conquering Gaul, stormed that hill fort, built a Roman fort up there. And then in the Middle Ages, the English built a castle there and the French took it, the English took it back. You can't move for this kind of history here. So I love writing about that. And I love writing about the food and the drink. And have you seen this? This is my wine.
I have. I have. It's amazing.
I make my own wine here. And it's a classic. It's a classic kind of Bordeaux in that it's a mixture of Cabernet Sauvignon, Cabernet Franc, Merlot, and Malbec. Now, Malbec is one of the oldest grapes in the world. We know that the Gauls would make, and the Romans would make wine with it. It's known as the wine of Cahors. And Malbec was the wine that was served at the wedding of Eleanor, Duchess of Aquitaine, in the year 1152. And I've got some of that, some of that wine in my own wine. I love it. So here's cheers to everybody. And above all to you, McKenna.
I'll take my morning coffee.
So I just love this place. And I like the people. What I like is that not only do they have their own history, their own culture, they've had their own language. I mean, I've got neighbors in this little village that on their telephone answering, they will speak not in French, they will speak in patois, in the old Occitan language that dates back for 1,000 years and more. It's the language in which the troubadours wrote their poetry and sang of chivalry and of love and so on. And I've become really interested in these troubadours. There was a great American poet, Ezra Pound, who translated some of these troubadour songs into more modern English and French. And there was one of them, a guy I really admire, Bertrand de Born, who had a castle a bit further north from here in the Périgord. And he was a great friend of the son of King Henry II of England, the one who married Eleanor of Aquitaine. And the eldest son, Henry, was so tired of waiting for his father to give him some lands in France, he launched a bit of a revolution a bit of a war against his father. And in the course of it, he died, and his great buddy and partner, Bertrand de Born, was captured and was hauled before King Henry, who said, well, before I pronounce sentence of death, have you anything to say? And Bertrand de Born said, I wish to sing a plaint, that's a lament for my friend, your son. And he did so. And by the end, King Henry had tears pouring down his face and said, for the love you had for my son, I restore to you your life and your lands. And when Dante wrote the Divine Comedy, he brought in this character, Bertrand de Born. When you go down into the Inferno, who is standing there but Bertrand de Born with his head under his arm as a symbol of a rebellion against his lord. So I adore this kind of stuff. And I just never run out of ideas. I never run out of things I want to research and to learn more about. And I keep putting it into my Bruno books.
Well, that leads us into the next question I have, which is that while we've fallen in love with Bruno and the characters in Saint Denis, every book has a different story driven by a real life issue, whether it's truffle trade, immigration, or this time insurance fraud. How do you come across those issues? Is it something you read about in the paper and get a spark, or what lets you choose what's going to happen in the next book?
Well, the one that this chateau on the shooting at Chateau Rock began in a way back in the early 1970s, long before you were born, McKenna. I was a very young reporter on The Guardian, the British newspaper, writing about politics. But I was listening, as everybody was in those days, to rock music. And I went to the editor and I said, look, we're writing nothing in the paper about rock music. It's the most important cultural form for people of my age. We've got to start doing something. The editor said, okay, Martin, you do it in your spare time, but you carry on doing your ordinary work. But if you want to write about rock music, do what you want. So I had a whale of a time. I was there at the launch, at the premiere of Pink Floyd's Dark Side of the Moon at the London Planetarium. I was there at the launch when David Bowie was doing Aladdin Sane. I was there. I interviewed David Bowie at the time. I interviewed Mick Jagger. I was invited to the ball Mick Jagger gave for Bianca at Blenheim Palace. I went on tour with Procol Harum, with The Who. I had a whale of a time. And then along came punk and I began to lose interest in the music, or maybe I just got too old or something. But I knew that some of these old rockers had bought homes in parts of France. And David Gilmour of Pink Floyd for many years had a small chateau here. So I thought, I can bring some music into this. So Chateau Rock is a chateau owned by an old British rocker in the book. And his much younger wife wants to divorce. They've raised their kids in this chateau. The eldest son, Jamie, is studying music at the Royal College of Music in London. The daughter, Kirsten, wants to go into, excuse me, wants to go into wine. And they're having a last summer together before they're going to sell Chateau Rock. It's very sad for Bruno. He doesn't want to lose them. But then at the same time, something else of my life, which was, as I think you know, I was based in Moscow for many years as a correspondent for The Guardian in the time of Gorbachev and Perestroika. Wonderful, wonderful time to be a journalist in Moscow. And I've stayed in touch with Russian affairs and so on ever since. And I know Ukraine quite well. So this war that Russia launched, that Putin launched against Ukraine, touched me very deeply because the place I know. And also the business of oligarchs and what they're doing with their money also interested me. And then a Maltese woman, a Maltese journalist called Caruana, was blown up in her car and in a political assassination because she'd been working upon the scandal of Russian and other wealthy people being sold European citizenship. They could buy themselves a Maltese or a Cypriot passport. And so I began to bring these things together. And I also wanted to bring in something that was really local, which is the local sheep farming industry, because the quality of the lamb here in the Périgord is famous. It's like a appellation contrôlée. So I had this old sheep farmer who decides that he will buy himself a kind of insurance policy. He gives up his farm, his sheep, and in return, he will get a life, the rest of his life, in a hugely luxurious retirement home in a nearby chateau. Except somehow the poor old guy dies before he can go there. And what infuriates Bruno is that this damned insurance company, which now owns the sheep farm and all of his property, they do nothing about the sheep. Nothing. There are hundreds of ewes and young-born lambs who are not being fed, not being cared for, not being watered. This, to Bruno, is absolutely intolerable. And he decides he's going to go after these guys. And then these stories of the music, the rock musician, the Russian oligarchs, the insurance fraud, all start to come together with a lot of food and concerts along the way.
Yeah, it's an absolute delight. So you mentioned already that you're, woe is you, stuck in the Périgord during this time. Are you finding time to write? Are you working on another Bruno book, or is Cookbook the main focus right now?
Well, I can tell you that the book for the Bruno book for next year is now written. It's with the publishers. It's called The Coldest Case. And it comes from another one of my neighbors, Raymond. Now, Raymond was a retired captain of gendarmes who also served as President Chirac's bodyguard for a while. He is full of stories. And one of his very first cases back over 30 years ago was the body of a young man with no identification upon him was found deep in the woods by a guy with a dog. And Raymond spent years trying to identify who this guy might be. Could never do so. He was pretty sure, because it had been a year since the guy had been killed, he was pretty sure he'd find some evidence of violence against the guy. He sort of dug through the ground beneath him looking for bullets. There weren't any. He suspected there had to be something. And finally, he took off the head of this corpse and boiled it to get down to the skull underneath. This is all entirely true. Wow. And it was then that he found that the skull had been cracked and caved in here, and he was able to match it to a camping tool. Now, this guy had been camping somewhere in the woods. Somebody had killed him. That was as far as Raymond could go. But for years, he kept the photograph of this skull. And I remember I was having drinks with him one evening, and I saw this skull up on his wall, and I thought, what's the story here? And that gave me the idea to launch The Coldest Case That Comes Back to Life. Yeah, you cannot, there are so many interesting people and stories here. I mean, one of the great Americans of the 20th century was Josephine Baker, the jazz singer, who became the toast of Europe, the highest paid superstar of the 20s and 30s. But what is less well known is she became a heroine of the French resistance because she had a castle here. And I used that in one of my stories as well, the one that came out last year, which was The Body in the Castle Well. And I brought in Josephine Baker and the fact that de Gaulle himself had insisted that she be made a member of the Légion d'honneur. And in the course of that, I found something else while I was researching all of this, which I hadn't known, which is that Josephine Baker was always a passionate supporter of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. And when he gave his famous speech, I Have a Dream, in Washington, Josephine Baker was standing beside him. And she was the one who led the crowd in singing, "We Shall Overcome." And when Martin Luther King was assassinated, his widow, Corinna, said to Josephine Baker, "Can you please take over the leadership of this movement? We need somebody with a name like yours." And Josephine Baker said, "Yes, I would love to, except that I have this project back in the Périgord where I've adopted children from different races all around the world, and I'm raising them as one single family, and I can't let the kids down." And I mean, you could not make this up. And there was just so many stories like that. And every time I see one, I make a little note and I start to think, and off we go. Another Bruno comes to life.
So you've written quite a few books now. What was your favorite book to write and why?
It's every writer will tell you that there's a special place in their heart for their first book. And my first book was about the history of extreme right-wing politics in Britain and in Europe. I wrote that back in the mid-70s. But then there's another book that was really very, very close to my heart. It was my history of the Cold War history that was published in lots of languages around the world. And it was really the entire history of the Cold War, from when the British and Americans began to realize that they would have a problem with the Soviet Union after Germany's defeat back in 1944, all the way up to the fall of the Berlin Wall and so on. And because that was my life, I mean, I'd been born in the earliest years of the Cold War, and I'd known it as a backdrop. So many American kids of my age remember having to duck and cover under their desks, and we'd gone through similar things in Britain. And as a journalist in Moscow and in Washington, I'd actually had a ringside seat at the closing events of the Cold War. And you were very lucky in a Texan, George Herbert Walker Bush, as the president at that time, who I interviewed several times, and also in Mikhail Gorbachev. And I remember I interviewed both of them repeatedly, but there was one great moment. It was when Bush was having his first summit with Gorbachev in Malta. Now, you remember Malta, middle of the Mediterranean. Bush came in an American battleship. Gorbachev came in a Soviet cruise ship. And suddenly a storm blew up. Now, remember your Bible, Jonah and the whale? It was near Malta that the storm blew up. This was a bad storm. Bush could not get off his American battleship. Gorbachev was stuck on his Soviet ship. I was stuck on the Soviet ship with Gorbachev. And I was having a drink we were thinking, what's going to happen now? We knew that Bush couldn't get there. So I was in the lounge and I had a drink with Edward Shevardnadze, who at the time was the Soviet foreign minister I knew quite well. who should then come in but Gorbachev? So they've got nobody else to talk to. So they're talking away to me about how is this going to work out, the end of the Cold War, we really think we can do it. I was so wrapped up in this as a journalist and as a human being that has a special place in my heart. Then the first book I wrote about the Perigord, the caves of Perigord, that is also of huge importance. But then every single new Bruno becomes my favorite. I mean, and that's something else that every mystery writer will tell you, that they always have a thing for the latest book and the one they're thinking of next.
Sure. Speaking of writing Bruno, do you have complete control of him, or does he have a mind of his own at this point?
He's had a mind of his own for years. There was, I always write I spent quite some time trying to develop a plan, chapter by chapter, what's going to happen. And in one of the novels, I think it was number 5, the English title was The Devil's Cave. My German publishers have always got really, really better skills than I do in titles. They called it Femme Fatale, the fatal woman. And in this novel, I had a femme fatale, a very beautiful, wicked, dangerous, seductive woman who decides for her own nefarious purposes, she's going to seduce Bruno. Now, in my plan, Bruno, he's just a guy. We're helpless in the face of female wiles and so on. And he succumbs. When I came to write that chapter, nope. It was like a force field was coming out of the desk at me. I am not going to drop my trousers for that book. And I thought, he's got a life of his own. But my God, I'm going to have to rewrite the whole of the ending. And so I have to leave a certain fluidity, because I know that it's not just Bruno now, it's all of the characters. Because I feel like I'm in the middle of a soap opera, a bit like Cheers, because there's not just Bruno, there's the Baron. There's Pamela, the mad English woman who turns out to be Scots with the riding school, her partner Miranda. There's Fabiola, the doctor. There's Gilles, the journalist, whom Bruno first met in Sarajevo in the battles in the Balkans. There is Jack Crimson, the retired British intelligence guy. There's the mayor. There is Jacqueline, the historian. And, their children, and they're all meeting together every Monday evening for dinner. And they've all got their own stories and their own histories. And they're more real to me in some ways than some of my friends. But what's interesting is that every single male character in these novels has got a real source or a real model, and I can use those role models, like Raymond, the old gendarme, who is in effect Jean-Jacques, the head of detectives, or the Baron, who is the Baron, or the mayor, who is the mayor, and so on. What I can't do is I can't use any of the women whom I know as models, because I'm baffled. Women are just too mysterious for us simple guys. So I have to try and invent these women. And I wouldn't dare use my wife or daughters or her sister or other friends. I mean, you never know when you're going to get things wrong with women. But because I have these daughters, I have always refused to write any explicit love scene. I mean, I remember how they used to do it in Hollywood in the old days. There'd be a passionate embrace, screen fades, came the dawn, and you leave it to your imagination. So that's what I do with Bruno, except in this book, I have written the first sex scene, but it's not Bruno, it's Balzac, his basset hound, it's time for Balzac to become a daddy. And he meets Bruno helps to arrange this wonderful female basset, pedigree basset called Diane de Poitiers, who is named after the mistress of a French king. And so we have to describe the mating of the pedigree of assets. And it it was a challenge, I can tell you.
Do your friends in the Perigord know that they're the characters?
They do indeed. I mean, it's not only are my books published in French, but the French government's given me a gold medal for services to tourism because of the number of people who come in. And various local bodies have brought me in. So in the last novel, which was The Body in the Castle Well, I described what it was like to be brought into the confrérie of foie gras, the body of local people who look after the reputation of this delicacy and have to decide and judge the best foie gras of the year. Now, I was brought into this confrérie. I'm a chevalier of foie gras. Then I'm a chevalier of several of the local wines. And in the Bergerac, we have a consulate, which was the body that governs the quality of wines. And it was founded in the year 1254, which is, I think, 230 or 40 years before Columbus actually arrived in the US, in the Americas. And there were always 20 grand consuls, and I'm the first Scotsman in all of these 750 years or so. And I'm very proud of that. But it means that I have to be on the jury when we decide which is going to be the wine of the year, which are the wines we send up to Paris for the big concours. And I have the right, because I've got a medal that gives me this right, to go into any vineyard in the Bergerac and say, I want to test the wines. It's a tough job. Somebody has to do this.
It sounds terrible.
But I mean, the French, I know they have a reputation for being a bit difficult, but I find these Perigord people they could not be more welcoming and friendly. Not just to me, but to Julia and our daughters and our friends, and they are generally nice people.
Yeah. I actually have a question for later that says, assuming we can ever travel internationally again, what are 3 tips for international visitors to the Perigord region?
It's still a bit up in the air. As of next week, June the 14th, people from other parts of Europe, Germany, Italy, Spain, Belgium, and Holland will be able to come fairly freely into France. It's still a bit less clear with Britain because there's quite a high level of infection there. And the British are talking about trying to impose some sort of 14-day quarantine, but we don't know the details yet. But we're hoping that by July, the Perigord will be open again for tourism and for business. And a lot of people are a bit nervous about this because there's a lot of talk about a second wave and whether the reinfection rate will be there. But I have to say that we're in this part of the Perigord where I am, there are this grouping of these 3 big villages. There's Les Aisies, there's Le Buc, there's Saint-Cyprien. We have not had a single case, let alone no deaths, but not a single case. In the whole of the Perigord region, we've had a total of 9 deaths, but every one of them was in an old folks in a retirement home. It's obviously it's particularly dangerous for older people. So you're fine, McKenna.
I'll be there to help you taste the wine tomorrow. Speaking of wine, what is your current wine of choice aside from the one behind you to drink on one of these early summer afternoons?
Well, it depends on the time of year. When it's in summertime, I will tend to drink either a rosé, nicely chilled, or what's called a kir, which is a glass of white wine with a splash of crème de cassis, or cream of a liqueur of blackcurrant into it. And that's a very, very pleasant, refreshing drink. Then again, here in the Bergerac, we have a unique wine only that's made around here. It's called Rosette, which is a very slightly sweet white wine. It's partly dry, partly semi-sweet. It's delicious, not just to drink on a summer's evening, but I have quite a few strawberries in my garden, and I have been mashing them up with half a glass of this rosette wine. It's lovely. Um, I'll be, after we finish here, I'm going over to Raymond, the neighbors, the old gendarme, where he's preparing a barbecue. And I know we have a bottle of very serious Péchamont wine, which is a grand wine from the Bergerac. Um, so I pretty much drink anything depending upon the time of day, the time of year, and so on. What I'm particularly proud of is something you'll find in the cookbook next year when it comes out. Everybody has heard of, excuse me, a Boeuf Bourguignon, which is basically it's beef in Burgundy wine. And I thought, well, why not with Bergerac wine? So I made it with Bergerac wine, and with carrots in the classic way. And I thought we can do something with this. So I've always made something called Vin de Noix, which is walnut wine. And we do it every year. Before the 20th of June, we go out into the woods and we collect about 40 or 50 green walnuts. So they're not firm yet, they're all white and soft inside. We chop them up, put them into a great big pot with 8 liters of either red wine or white wine, needn't be good wine. And then we need the contacts for this. We have to get a liter of not quite legal eau de vie, but lots of people make it. So 8 liters of the wine, a liter of eau de vie, with all of these chopped up green walnuts, half a kilo, a pound of sugar, stir it all up, cover it, leave it in a dark corner for a couple of months, stirring once a week, filter it, bottle it, and I always add a glass of my own Vin de Noix to my Boeuf Périgordine. So I enjoy doing that. These are things I learned to do here. I never had the slightest idea, McKenna, that I'd be making wine, I'd be making Vin de Noix, I'd be gardening for my potatoes and my zucchini and so on. This place just makes you change your life.
I see your pictures on Facebook, and it looks quite idyllic. Your roses and your peas and the hedgehogs, and I'm like, oh, he's got it made.
And the chickens, don't forget the chickens.
And the chickens, absolutely. So we do have a couple questions from the comments. Shelley asks if Bruno will ever marry or have kids.
He hasn't told me yet. He wants to. Bruno desperately wants to settle down with a woman who he loves and have children. And he keeps falling in love with these powerful, independent-minded women who are quite happy to have an affair with him, but have no intention of settling down to motherhood and being a housewife and so on. So there is Isabelle, this hugely attractive policewoman who is now a rising star in French security. There's Pamela with her riding school. And poor old Bruno, he is aching to be a dad. But I'm sure he'll find a way somehow. But then again, I have a problem because my wife, Julia, says to me, Martin, the moment Bruno settles down and marries, you're going to lose half your readers. And I always take Julia seriously.
Yeah. We don't want him off the market yet. And we have another question. So Pat asks, and I think I know the answer to this, but do you use your family as beta readers?
They're always my first readers. So Julia, my wife, and she's involved in the beginning because she's the co-author of the cookbooks. She's a much better cook than I will ever be. And I always have to cook every recipe that's in the book, in the Bruno novels, but with Julia at my shoulder telling me not so much salt or not so much garlic. And then we have these 2 daughters. There's Kate, who is a journalist, a sports journalist on Grand Prix Formula One racing cars. And she, but not this year, but normally she spends most weekends of the year at a different Grand Prix. And she is also a writer herself. And then the younger one, Fanny, who lives in Seattle, she's a poet and a playwright. So they're all my first three readers. And Fanny is the one who tries to make sure I don't have any terrible old male chauvinist sexism in there. And Julia makes sure that the food is right. And Kate tries to keep up the pace of the action. And
well, it sounds like a perfect balanced crew of readers you've got there. A little magic formula helping you out.
Well, it's I must say it's been wonderful growing up or getting older in a family with this wife who we've now been over 40 years married, and these two terrific daughters. But that's why we always had to have male basset hounds. So I would have a bit of testosterone company around. And,
Fair enough. So we have one more question from the comments. And just as a reminder, before I say this question, for those of you who have tuned in a little bit later, we're talking with Martin Walker about the shooting at Chateau Rock. And if you order a copy of it from us, we have this special postcard that has a recipe from the cookbook. This recipe is little blue cheese tarts with pears and walnuts. But the question from the comment is from Pat, who asked if there's a must-try recipe in the cookbook.
A must-try? There are several. There's the little tart recipe. The rest of the blue cheese tarts on the back of the postcard is really a good one. There is Bruno's gazpacho, the cold soup, which is really good. There is the boeuf périgourdine, and I even tell you how to make vin de noix, the walnut wine. And then there are, one of my favorite dishes is, we have these big mushrooms in Europe. They're called cèpe in France. They're called porcini in Italy. And they're really big. And what we like to do is we put a chunk of goat's cheese, a little crottin, a little sort of cylinder of goat's cheese in them. And then we sprinkle on some crushed walnuts and drizzle over that some honey. And we put that on top of the barbecue so that the mushroom cooks and this lovely cheese flavor and the texture of those nuts and the sweetness of the honey all come in together. Delicious.
It sounds delicious. Hopefully we'll get a chance to either have you here in person next year when that comes out, or we'll do this again and talk more about those. For all the one-on-one interviews that I do, I like to take some questions from the Proust questionnaire for the authors, so we get to know you a little bit better. None of them are the terribly difficult dark ones. Those of you who don't know what the questionnaire is, just came up with this in the late 1880s. It's a bunch of questions that he would talk to people about at parties where you get to kind of know the real person. So I just have a few from that to end the talk. What is your most treasured possession, not your family?
My dog.
I almost said and not your dog, but I'll take it.
Okay. Well, if it's not my dog, it's going to be my deux chevaux, my old 50-year-old little two-cylinder French car. It's the Germans call it a duck, an enter. It sounds like a mowing machine, a lawn mowing machine, and it constantly breaks down, but I love it.
Well, that's wonderful. Who is your hero of fiction, and by another author, not Bruno?
I think Sherlock Holmes has to be the man. I remember as a boy becoming devoted to these books. Yeah.
What talent would you most like to have?
To be able to play the piano or a musical instrument.
Okay. And the last question to end on, what is your idea of perfect happiness?
Oh, being here in the Périgord with my wife and daughters and friends, eating, drinking, and just being together.
It sounds pretty fantastic to me. You certainly have painted a lovely picture of it. So before I say goodbye, I'd just like to remind everyone that we are currently closed to the public. We're working on a plan for appointments, and we'll be in touch soon about that. But if you'd like the book, we are certainly doing contactless curbside pickup. You can call us at 713-524-8597 or email us at order@murderbooks.com to place an order, or you can go to our website at murderbooks.com. Also, if you've enjoyed all of the delightful things we've been talking about today, I would recommend checking out brunochiefofpolice.com because he has just so much content on there that's delightful about the Perigord region, recipes, Bruno, everything you want to read more about. Tomorrow I'll be talking with Natalie Jenner about the Jane Austen Society, which is a book that we highly recommend for fans of the Guernsey Literary and Potato Peel Pie Society. That'll be at 3 o'clock, and she'll be talking to me from Canada. So one of the lovely things about doing these is the long distance chats. But thank you so much to Martin Walker, to his team at Knopf, and for taking the time to join us today. Cheers.
Your very good health, McKenna. Thank you very much.
You too as well. Bye.